is going on, everybody? It is Master Signified Bodies. It has been a while since I posted anything on my channel. I think the last thing I posted was the discussion on Hegel and Marx with Isaiah, which was a good conversation. Sadly, it had to be cut short because my broke ass does not have the Zoom Pro, so hopefully in the future we can do longer sessions. It's usually Nick who has the Zoom account set up when we do the Vuoi stuff. So also, now that I mentioned Vuoi, I'd like to let you all know that we finally finished Seminar 1. If you haven't already checked it out, please check out the entire Seminar 1 series with 3 guest discussions. One, Brian Becker from Singularity as Sublimity. Sorry, Freudian slip right there. I'm not going to cut that out. I'm just going to leave that in there for y'all to see. And then Derek Hook, amazing Lacanian scholar. And then the man, the myth, the legend, Todd McGowan. So please check those out. Seminar 2 will be rolling soon. Just a little bit of time to recollect our thoughts, make the time and space for recording that. But rest assured, Seminar 2 will be conducted. So this episode is going to be kind of like a filler and completion from the original project that I had on the Lacan series that I was doing by myself prior to meeting Nick. And I think it would just be a little redundant if I just try to do the whole thing by myself. What I want to do is kind of just complete the series that I've already started and give a little summary, just a little appetizer, because I want you to check out that channel because I'm mainly invested in that channel, the Vuoi, more than this. But I still want to make some video essays, some concept video essays, just to get the juices flowing. So I think where I left off last was on 2 narcissisms and their critique of Jung that Lacan had, which I also wrote a Substack and Medium article discussing that. So I'll put the link below. Check it out. If you like it, give a thumbs up or comment. If you have any criticisms, please put them. Don't be afraid to put them because it's only going to help me become a better writer and understand what I'm doing. So with that being said, we left off on 2 narcissisms. And if you've been following the video series, we know that Lacan's project is a return to Freud. It will always be that, but seminars 1 and 2 are specifically dedicated to critiquing ego psychology and its therapeutic practices, as well as some of what he will call the blind alleys, especially in object relations theorist Michael Ballant. But before we get into that, let's continue to retrace our steps. The reason why ego psychology is bad, according to Lacan, is that, well, it's so strict with their institutionalized practices, but also it guides the patient rather than guiding the treatment. We see an example of that in Anna Freud in engaging into the affective relationship of the patient when the patient is having this like sudden episode of anxiety. And then we see in a psychoanalytic account of Margaret Little, which apparently it wasn't Margaret Little who was the analyst. We read that wrong. It was Margaret Little writing an account on apparently analyst who was treating the patient who had the radio broadcasting. He had the radio broadcasting show, and then the night before he was supposed to go on air, his mother passed away, and so then he continued on with it, and then he was feeling a little confused and pretty much, well, using Lacanian terms, his symbolic register was out of whack. And it was the not picking the right time to respond. So there's also that the importance of timing and when an analyst should speak. And this led to an episode of a countertransference in which it reoriented this patient's ego. And so going further, we have this investigation of object relations and then like the ego psychology that comes afterwards from the tradition that Anna Freud lays down. And Lacan is kind of more really like a critical reader of objects' relations because he sees a lot of benefits into it, but the main thing that Lacan, and he'll obviously mention this in Seminar 4, but they're still focused on like this imaginary aspect, but insofar as that there is only, again, a subject and object. And I'll just leave it at that for now because I want to leave that for later when we talk about Michael Balint. Then we get into the optical schema, which I'd rather just have you watch that episode both on this channel and then the more elaborated version on Vuoi. But again, if you are only learning Lacan through my videos, you are wrong. Grapple with Lacan by reading the seminars. Don't be that motherfucker that literally will be like, oh, I'm going to pick up the Acree and try to read. No, don't read the Acree. That's a headache right there. If you really want to not enjoy, allow yourself to not enjoy, grapple with seminars 1, 2, in my opinion, 1, 2, and then read 11, and then anything there in between. Don't feel like you have to read every single one in order, but 1, 2, 11, any side literature to help with Lacan, like secondary text, reading seminars 1 and 2 edited by Jacques Lacan Seminar and then Bruce Fink is a great one. And then they have the other one, which is reading Seminar 11, which is a good one. But I would not try to grapple with any other side text unless you are really into psychoanalytic theory to the extent where it becomes part of your philosophical framework or you plan on being a clinician. So, the optical schema is something that Lacan pretty much will play with the entire seminar. It'll be the groundwork for understanding his 3 registers of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. To reiterate, the imaginary is going to be the formation of the ego through the mirror stage. The symbolic order has to do with the register of language, and it is enacted through speech. There is an imaginary relationship between a subject and a subject, but what mediates that, and especially in the analytic session, is the third, which is speech and the register of language. He will say that the real is reality in itself, but we will see that later on that the real is that which resists symbolization, or it's that which represents or we encounter in the gaps of the ego and the unconscious, that there's this ontological gap. There are holes in the symbolic structure, and the real should be located there, but the real is also protected by the fantasy, and the fantasies are going to be, in a sense, created by the imaginary aspect, but we should see these holes symbolically structured. There's a structural lack, and that's where we will see the real. But for now, he says that the real is located with reality in itself, or if we could imagine something about libido before the mirror stage, in this investment in a libidinal economy of the narcissistic ego, right? Getting after the 2 narcissisms, we have the understanding of ego ideal, right? And I think I mentioned that too, the difference between the ideal and the ego ideal, that the ideal ego represents, like, we should think of this as like something of the primary narcissism, and then the ego ideal as the secondary narcissism. We'll play onto this in god-awful German translation of mine, but Nick knows how to pronounce this, but I'll do my best. It's the only one that's titled in German. Zeitlich eigentlich Lunggeschichte, right? What this seminar has to deal with, right, is Hippolyte is putting Lacan into question because he has a hard time understanding the correspondences between the optical schema of like the bouquet, the container and non-contained, and the I, what this accounts for is like we see as like a development of the subject and its being and temporality. To sum it up, he will always play with this notion of this is what makes us different from the animal. And right here is a perfect example, and he says that the animal is caught up in multiple lures, right? Multiple lures of the image, of the spectacle. It's captivated and captated. It is both drawn in by this image, but it's also captured by it, right? But there is no language in the sense that structures our reality, situates us in a given time and instant. The animal, with that not having language, allows them to get caught up in multiple lures, so therefore it leads them from the possibilities of, should I say, a spectacle par excellence that we are invested in. But we should recognize that the spectacle of the image, the lure, is not something of knowledge. Rather, he will reiterate this. It's méconnaissance. The ego is primarily made up of misrecognition and resistances that it itself is. We can see the resistances as different symptoms, different fantasies, and fixations. And what it is resisting from its own failure, its own misrecognition, right? We should see those two concepts which he will bring into play from the function of field of speech and language, the full speech and empty speech. The empty speech has to deal with the idle chatter. But we shouldn't see it in this philosophical sense as like, because I say that because he kind of gets this from Heidegger. But like, you could be in an analytic session and you could be talking about concepts, you could be talking about philosophy and what you do, like that you're always thinking about ontology, you're always thinking about ethics, the meaning of life. That could still be empty speech to the analyst because it's not registering anything. There's no transference right there. You're not saying anything that will lead to understanding more about the unconscious, about your desire. And so empty speech leads to a deformity and its own failure. And this is what these resistances entail, are something that is trying to hide the refusal or the rejection, or as we should call it in the Verneinung, or the commentary on Verneinung, the Verneinung, Erwerfung, these negations that try to resist the affirmation and revelation of the unconscious, like the famous thing of the Wolfman in session with Freud, saying that he had a dream about a woman, and he's like, I can assure you that this is not my mother, but is like at this conscious level, he had this need to reject or to resist, to negate that, and he didn't have to necessarily say that. He just said it was a woman, right? There was no need to, there was no assumption that it had to be his mother. But this could also be, I think it was the Wolfman who actually read a lot of Freud, and I think at this point he was deep in his treatment and probably was thinking, it's like, oh no, I'm getting closer to the Oedipal complex. And so this conscious need to reject or refuse is also an empty speech, which tries to reject getting closer to its own failure and the bringing about of a revelation of the signifier within the unconscious. Right. Now, with that being said, this speech, right, is something, or this language, the symbolic order, right, which is enacted by speech. This is what situates us in the world, the Umwelt, as we would call it, that is way different from animals. This is our second alienation, because the first alienation is going to be the primary narcissism from the mirror, the alienation via the image, but then you have the second alienation in which now there is something of a register, the symbolic, which then we have this relationship of the ego ideal with the symbolic order, or as we should see, more of a relationship with the superego, right? Because the ego ideal is not in the symbolic. It still has this imaginary mirroring, but it is situated, if that makes sense, by the symbolic order and the language and imperative of the law. This is pretty much what Lacan wants to get at in this chapter, is this differentiation between animal and man via the two distinct stages of alienation, pretty much. And the fact that we are the only ones that, in the lure, we maintain this one. We don't go into different lures. We're not constantly in different lures. And this, I think, is the fact that he wants to emphasize the notion of drives, especially death drive. He won't say death drive specifically. He'll say the death instinct, coined by Strachey. But he will then want to bring about this instance of like a repetition, especially with this lure, right? The repetition and compulsion to repeat. He will say more like the compulsion to repeat. And that when we look at mirroring, we shouldn't see like the mirror stage as something developmental, because this is the thing that a lot of people misunderstand, is that the mirror stage represents an aspect of child development. Lacan was very critical of child development theory. This is due to the fact that he is more of a structural thinker, and that when we're already thrown into the world, we're already thrown into language, right? And we should look back at the little dick thing, that the little dick had language. He just didn't have speech. We should look at the wolf child, Robert. He had a list of problems, had a lot of hallucinations, a lot of aggressivity, yet he was still immersed in the symbolic order because he had one word. His one signifier was the wolf. But yet he had trouble in in obtaining some type of captation or captivation with an image, because when there were instances of mirroring, he would undermine it by attacking somebody, as if there was mirroring in maybe the gaze of another child. And even seeing his own reflection, he would hit like the mirror or a window if he saw like a minor reflection through a window, because you could see some reflection through a window or a glare. All these things indicate that there is no true development, right? There is this contradiction between the Darwinian aspect of evolution, but even in this necessary development of the ego, which is very much a misunderstanding in ego psychology, that you could see them as neo-Freudians or post-Freudians, or trying to go against Freud. But they think that the ego is a development and that's something that we have to strengthen to make healthy. But no, the ego doesn't necessarily lead to a development, right? The ego is actually contingent, but nonetheless, it's dialectical, right? And it undermines itself. And this is a perfect example of undermining happen. It's a masochism in the way that, in this way that he's mirrored, it is not perfect to the classical model of how the mirror stage in Lacan's essay displays, that there's this instance of a sadomasochism. Sadomasochism, because obviously Wolfchild is hitting the other person, but he's not hitting that person because he enjoys, he gets jouissance or pleasure from destroying them. Rather, is aiming at destroying that image that is being captivated and captured by the other. We see this again in the seesaw of desire when he mentions the little girl that, in the instance of mirroring, hits a little boy she's playing with upside the head. What we're trying to get at is the fact that there is this instance in undermining in this instance of mirroring that comes up, because we should see it as not something that is progressive. It's traumatic. And he makes a reference of Freud's grandson, who made up the little game Fort Da which is the example that we see in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, to show that there is this primal scene, or the scene that is always in constant repetition to master, always mastering the scene of the traumatic experience via some type of symbolic thing or fantasy. And what it is like the kid was tossing objects away and then retrieving them back in. And as he begins to develop speech and his symbolic order, he then starts to make words for these games, and he's got like a little like silk reel or something like that, and as he tosses the reel he says "for," and as he retrieves it back it's "da." It's the repetition and overall the compulsion to repeat, to master the primal scene of being separated from the mother in the case of Freud's grandchild. This will be crucial going into Seminar 2, because we have to have an intimacy with the Beyond the Pleasure Principle after leaving Seminar 1. But the death drive and even the real are lingering in Seminar 1. We have to pay close attention. Yeah, we could say like, oh, this is like Lacan and his imaginary symbolic phase and yada yada yada, but the real is there. He's like, in a sense, building it up, because these other people that he's having in his lecture, they're all like analysts. These are private lectures and seminars. It doesn't become public until Seminar 11, where he gives it out to like other academics and stuff that are outside analytic theory, and where he meets Jacques Lacan Seminar. These are just private seminars, and a lot of them aren't duped, right? They're like, what is this guy saying? So imagine like bringing up the notion of the real as we're used to now that we have all these seminars. They're like barely thinking like, what's this thing about the symbolic order? But yet they're understanding when he's bringing all these things about like linguistics. And now this brings me to like the last part I want to talk about when it comes about like linguistics and what I mentioned, object relations. Towards the end of the seminar, he starts to build up the importance of the signifier and the symbol, not just this reference of, oh, we got speech and language that make up the symbolic order. What it is the sign, the signifier, the symbol. One thing that he has problems with in object relations, like I said earlier, was this phenomenological notion, which he coins with Michael Ballant, right? Michael Ballant's essay on primary love happens when the child develops this object of love from the mother. But that doesn't really say anything about why he would want that, or why the child would want that object, right? Or this he gets close to this intersubjective relationship, but then he retreats back to this immediate object in relation to just the child as the subject. Lacan shows us that this doesn't account for other things, mainly like when we look at perversion. And that Ballant believes that through primary love and in one's, again, development, because he's talking about development, leads to the greatest achievement in overcoming of the Oedipal complex, a moral achievement, genital love. Lacan says it's the most dubious achievement, right? We should look back to Freud's 3 Essays of Sexuality, where he talks about we are born polymorphously perverse, right? Genital love is contingent, and only contingent to our society's norms. And with that being said, this mapping of sexuality that happens to be genital is just surprisingly a thing, but it isn't necessarily the case. Even D&G talk about this, and they take this up on its head of being polymorphously perverse, that every part of the body itself is just libido. But as we develop subjectivity, we experience the body as sexual, as jouissance. We don't have a body, we only have a subjective understanding of the body in pleasure or pain. And thus, that is what makes the body sexual, because its libido is mapping itself. And polymorphous perversity is a key theme, because this is what Lacan is also want to take up to par with Michael Ballant and the notion of perversion and the critique of object relations. that perversion, in any instance, has a symbolic register that Balint is missing, because he only comes close to intersubjectivity, but not the mediation of intersubjectivity, which, again, what did we talk about with intersubjectivity or two bodies? You got to account for the third, the symbolic order, not just in speech, like he said before, not just in language, like he said before, but the signifier, the sign. This sign has to deal with a recognition, or at least will try to signify something towards desire, which, desire is always the desire of the other. And this is the main thing that he wants to point out, is that Balint doesn't go so far when he gets into the field of intersubjectivity. He stops only at this mother-son or mother-daughter, just mother-child thing, and the only thing that he has is the mother's object, which is love. That's what the baby wants. But no, the baby wants the recognition, and we will see that desire is always the desire of the other, which is not something that they have in them necessarily, but it's this recognition. At least for now, we'll see how he's playing this out. Because then when we get into like Lacan of the real, we're talking about objet A, objet petit a, which is totally different. But let's not get into that right now. We're talking about the sign, right? The sign is important. Signifier is important. Signifier structures recognition. It is a language. And then we get into understanding the importance of the signifier, and the fact that one thing about Balint is that though in his theoretical notions he is an object relations theorist and he's only stuck on his two-body psychology, but yet in his practice he recognizes the transference in the fact that he does not need to remain on the plane of affectivity, which is something that is a failure in ego psychology. He recognizes the dubiousness of language and the fact that he may not be able to understand the narrative that the patient is giving. And that being said, the patient could lie, in a sense. Sometimes this lying is productive. The patient made up a story, and he tells all his analysts, and that's why he can never find the right analyst. And Balint's like, yo, I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to cap, but I have no idea, how to make anything or any interpretation of what you're saying. And he's like, my God, you're the first analyst to ever say this. Then he lets him know, I've been trying to find the right analyst, and because it's been a hard time, I've been making up the story to try to see if these analysts are really about, their shit. And Balint was just like, yeah, I don't know. And so right there is this notion of realizing that there's something odd about this person's speech, the fact that they have the capacity to lie. But needless to say, it's important of listening, of paying attention to the language and the words being used. The signifier becomes important because this is what is going to transfer on, and we need to pay attention to the transference of the sign and how it, I'll say, quilts in, right? But it transfers on to the analyst. So far, analysts in his day, and you could even say now, not only in ego psychology, but even sometimes in object relations and other modalities, they focus so much on affectivity, on emotions, and the transference of emotions, that they remain on the imaginary plane and don't realize the order of the symbolic. The point is that, again, you've heard the term master signifier, that the situation of the master signifier, the sign, needs to be transferred onto the analyst, because that is where the work is going to be done. That is how this treatment is guided. So far as the analyst remains the little other to protect against the sign, and this is something that Derek Hook helped us out with, then there's always going to be this battle for mastery. Because at some point, the analysand will have resistances, just like the analyst can, because the analyst in some instances might do a countertransference. The goal is to guide the treatment. And if the analyst always remains a little other, then that means for the analysand, they will have mastery, because they're being resistant, and in the sign, the signifier, resistance to transference. He makes this example of how the sign operates in this really cool dialogue, De Magistro, in which is written by Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine and his son are having a discussion, and talks about language, and that pretty much all words are ultimately nouns, even conjunctions. You know, the word if, yeah, it's a conjunction, right? What if this? What if that? I'll only do this if. But as soon as you say something like, what is it about this word if? Or I don't like the word if, a conjunction becomes a noun. So he's saying it's like it's trying to name things. So the purpose of naming, the purpose of speaking and having a dialogue, and he's saying is that if there is speech, there is something to be taught. That with that, there's a master and a student, you know, a teacher and a learner. But what he's trying to do is bring out a knowledge. And again, it seems like very similar to what we get into the Meno, and it's kind of funny because, you know, St. Augustine was known as like a Neoplatonist for a certain amount of time until he, you know, converted to Christianity. But did some of that Platonism, you know, get rejected? He was probably still Platonist. But nonetheless, we see this kind of form in the form of the sign being guided, or in the dialectic of a student and a master, or the or student and a teacher, and the master and the slave. This whole Hegelian thing, we're seeing this in the session. The last thing I will say, because I want to wrap it up, is the fact that he will say that there's always going to be error in the start of the analytic session, that truth arises in error, and the fact of the matter is that the transference doesn't happen right away. It only happens once the thing is named, once there is the right time and the right space for it, it seems like. And again, I encourage you all to read this. I know I left a lot out, but I just kind of wanted to make it a short recap. Any questions, please leave them down in the comments. But I highly encourage you, one, to read Seminar 1, even read Seminar 2, reading Seminars 1 and 2 by Jacques Lacan Seminar and Bruce Fink, or edited by them. And then I highly encourage you to watch the Vuoi channel. I will put the link in the bottom. And for those of you who may still, you know, like this channel but feel a little uncertain or not convinced of psychoanalysis, we put, by we, Nick, myself, and Dave from Vuoi, pleeb, we went on his channel and we did a video segment on, you know, the importance of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Zizek. So check that out. I'll put the link in the bottom. And again, stay tuned for Seminar 2 on the Vuoi channel, and many more videos that I have spontaneously on some ideas. I just wanted to throw this one out there while I had the inspiration. But again, hope you all enjoyed this. Leave your comments. I appreciate the support. I'm all about having, you know, this free flow discussion and making sure that you gain something from it, but then you have questions, and then it inspires you to read and be productive, come up with your own concepts and ideas. Don't just be a priest for Lacan. Don't just be a priest for Zizek. Don't be a priest for Marx. Short circuit and create your own thing. That's the main goal, right? Because at the end of the day, nobody is a master at anything, all right? Nobody is going to be the master of Lacan, right? We have to undermine the master, let alone, lest we undermine ourselves. But until then, enjoy y'all symptoms, everybody, and I hope y'all have a good day. Thank you for watching. Tune in for more.